Welcome back to the SimHanger channel. My name's Mark. Thank you very much for joining me today. In the world of flight simulation, the phrase game changer is often used inaccurately and certainly inappropriately in many instances. But there are a number of things, in my personal opinion, that certainly fall into that category. And they could be things such as the visuals, flight model, peripheral sophistication, certainly virtual reality, and more recently mixed reality and motion platforms and so on. And today we're going to be having a look at something that I think will also fall into that game changer category, and that's force feedback. Now, after an absence of something in the region of about 2 decades, we're seeing the re-emergence of force feedback devices, and today we're going to be looking at the Moza force feedback base and flight stick. Now, I've already covered this in my previous video. In fact, that's what's playing behind me right now at the moment. So if you missed that video, I'll leave a link to that in the notes below. And there we have a look at the device itself in some detail, what you get, and we also gave it a test in DCS. Now, in that video, I said that once Microsoft Flight Simulator compatibility was confirmed, I would be doing a follow-up video, and this is exactly what this video is for. We're going to be delving into the Moza AB9 base and just see what sort of experience we can get in Microsoft Flight Simulator. So with that all said, let's get started. Before jumping into Sim, I just want to turn to the Moza Cockpit software quickly and cover off a few important points. Updates from Moza are coming thick and fast, but this software should be considered a work in progress at this point, and Moza themselves have told me that both the software and hardware upgrades now allow for the reading of the telemetry directly from Microsoft Flight Simulator, but the implementation of some of that data still needs to be improved, and this will be addressed in future updates. It also raises the obvious question with regards to Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024 compatibility. Moza said to me they're expecting native support for force feedback in the new Sim. However, this won't be available on day one, but are anticipating implementation within the first 12 to 18 months post-release. In the interim, they'll continue to directly read the telemetry data from the Sim, as is the case with 2020, and adapt and make changes to take advantage of any additional data available, as is needed and required. As mentioned in my previous video, I'm very impressed with the quality of the hardware itself. In my opinion, it's built to last. But what I do find encouraging is Moza's adaptability and willingness to make changes on suggestions from the community. In my opinion, whilst the software is not quite there yet, it holds great potential with the promise of more to come, and despite being priced towards the budget end of force feedback flight sticks, costing something near half to a quarter of their competitors, the software continues to grow in its sophistication. Now that we have compatibility with Microsoft Flight Simulator and DCS, of course, I haven't tried it in X-Plane. Let's have a quick look at what's available. As was the case with DCS, it comes with a number of pre-configured profiles, and Microsoft Flight Simulator is no exception. At time of recording, it had 4 profiles: Airbus A320, interestingly the Bell 407 helicopter, the proverbial Cessna 172, and the CTSL, more expected in the future. I'm aware they're currently working on a jet profile. As mentioned in my previous video, you can of course make your own profiles and save them accordingly, using the new preset option. I think it's worthwhile mentioning at this juncture that the amount of force feedback you get very much depends on the aircraft that you select. If you have an aircraft such as the A320, for example, the feedback will be nominal because it uses a fly-by-wire system, and this has been fairly accurately recreated. Just something to bear in mind. Under the basic settings, you have a number of options: direct input, which is for programs with direct force feedback integration, telemetry force feedback, which is what we need for Microsoft Flight Simulator, or integrated, which are a combination of both, which is what I'm using today. Under the basic settings, you can adjust things such as the spring, dampener, friction, and game force feedback intensity, which affect the physical characteristics of the joystick itself. However, the area we're most interested in is under the Telemetry tab, and here we can define some of the characteristics of how the data is interpreted, covering such issues as stall. You can select whether or not you have elevator droop on the aircraft, the impact of speed, gear, flaps, as well as the impact on your aircraft for turbulence, ground vibration, and wind, and so on. As mentioned previously, this is a work in progress. Not all the options are fully implemented at this time. You also have the option to define the particular characteristics of the aircraft, be it propeller, jet, or helicopter, which includes such things as engine rumble, speed limitations, and type and intensity of feedback. Before we jump into Sim, just to explain that I am using the MH16 flight stick, also from Moza. It's an optional and additional purchase to the base. Haven't had a chance to do a review on this separately at this point. Features an all-metal body, and quality of overall build is very, very good and equal to that of the base. Lighter than the Thrustmaster Warthog, which I used in DCS. The top hat switch is also an Axis if you want it to be. Overall, I'm very impressed. They make a great combo. I would also add that in terms of the amount of travel and the overall feel of this joystick, well, it's about the best I've ever experienced. We've now jumped into the sim in the Cessna 172. Now, the Cessna obviously uses a yoke, but it's a fairly basic aircraft and a great aircraft to test the basic telemetry. So in this case, I've decided not to use a predefined profile, but just read the telemetry directly from the sim via the Moza Cockpit software, made a few minor tweaks and enabled a few options, but other than that it's all at default. For anyone getting this peripheral, the only word of caution I would offer is careful, because you can overwrite the default profiles and it can be hard to find your way back. Moza need to correct this. Our engine is at idle and we can see that the joystick is vibrating, and as we increase the throttle so that vibration should reduce as the engine steadies, we should still get vibration, but it should be a whole lot finer, which is exactly what's happening. I'm still getting feedback from the joystick, but it's much finer. Throttle back to idle, the engine revs reduce and the vibration returns exactly as we would expect it to. Now you do get ground vibration roll. Let's just take off the parking brake and push the throttle forward a bit, and let's get moving. As I'm sure you can appreciate, it's really hard to show off force feedback in a video, but please bear with me, we'll do our best. Okay, so we're now starting to move. I'm getting a slight rumble as the wheels start turning, but I want to show you there's something that is pretty cool and unexpected, to be honest. We're just going to turn off the runway and head for that grass verge. Keep your eye on the joystick. The telemetry recognizes that we're on rougher ground and feeds that through to the joystick. And you can see there's much more aggressive movement here, yet it's not over the top. This particular feature is really well done. Okay, so let's head back to the runway. Of course, the amount of ground vibration, etc. that you feel will very much be subject to the type of aircraft that you're flying. The lighter, the better. Let's now go ahead and line up, and we'll push the throttle forward and let's get going. But we're not going to take off just yet. There's one more thing I'd like to show you before we get up in the air. Throttle now, forward. Airspeed is alive, and we're heading down the runway. Coming up on 40 knots, and this force feedback effect will make it very clear to you whether you butted your landing or not. We're a bit slow, but no matter. Once again, keep your eye on the joystick. Looks a bit like one of my normal landings, to be honest. But you can see the flight stick jumping up and down as we hit the ground. As I think I mentioned earlier, this joystick in its own right is very, very nice indeed. The amount of spring tension and dampener applied seems to me just right. But that's for something like the Cessna. If you're flying something heavier, this would feel a little too light, but you can adjust in the settings. If you fly and you don't start the force feedback Moza Cockpit software, the whole unit operates just as a normal flight stick or joystick. I hate to admit it, but it's better than my Whirlpool Alpha Constellation. Let's now stick our nose up and do a power on stall and see what sort of impact we get there. Speed is bleeding off very, very quickly. Starting to drop a wing. small vibration and a slight pull to the left, but that was a little underwhelming, to be honest. Not as good as I experienced in DCS with the same unit. Let's try that again, and now a power off stall. Airspeed is washing off. Pulling back on the stick to keep my nose in the air. Oh, that's a little bit better. Got a vibration just at the point that the nose dropped, but I would have expected a little more in the stall. However, this may just be a setting that needs to be adjusted. I did, however, try it with the C172 profile, and the effect was much the same. Now sticking my nose down to gain some speed, so we can assess the impact of dynamic force on the airframe. As the speed increases, so the wind force on the ailerons and the elevator increase, and the flight stick should be harder to manipulate, which it is, so this seems fairly well implemented. But we can check this by sticking our nose in the air, let the speed wash off, and as the speed reduces, so the flight stick should be easier to manipulate, which it is. Currently on live weather, and turbulence is set to realistic, and according to the METAR we've got gusts of 20 knots. So an opportunity to test the turbulence. Again, a reminder, this is just using the default telemetry. Whilst there is some nominal feedback, overall I would say the result is disappointing. Looks like I'm going to have to investigate the turbulence settings within the Moza Cockpit software. There is some feedback, but just not a lot. In these sort of winds, well, the flight stick should be kicking me. Perhaps this is one of the features that Moza said are not fully implemented yet. And of course, no review would be complete without testing a helicopter. This is the Bell 407. I'm not going to use the default telemetry alone. As shown earlier, there is a profile for the Bell 407, so I'm going to select that, and with the software you can make changes on the fly. In the interests of fairness, I do need to mention that the helicopter profile is still under initial development. They tell me they're still working on it. Quite a number of the features are still to be implemented, but nonetheless, it's worth a look. But one thing that's very well implemented is your flight stick is now a cyclic. The software has changed the physical characteristics and overall feel of the device. There's absolutely no return to center, and the cyclic stays in the position that you put it in, which makes controlling your helicopter a whole lot easier, something very important, as I am, by my own admission, an appalling helicopter pilot. I need all the help I can get. Okay, so here goes, no promises. Let's see if I can get into a hover position. I am getting some vibration through the cyclic, but I'm not able to really distinguish the difference between being on the ground and being up in the air. It does feel somewhat generic at this point, but using something akin more to a real helicopter control, I'm certainly doing better than I normally do. Drifting very slightly, but pretty much in a hover position. The amount of feedback through the cyclic does depend on the throttle, and I have to bear in mind, of course, that this is a generic helicopter within the sim, and of course the force feedback to the device depends on what sort of telemetry Microsoft Flight Simulator is giving out. That's enough hovering for now. Let's see if we can head over by the terminal and land on the apron. Pushing the throttle forward a little bit to raise the collective, pitch the nose down slightly to move forward, and we're heading to the terminal just in front of us there. The amount of feedback that I'm getting from the device hasn't really changed significantly, perhaps a slightly finer vibration being felt. As we approach the terminal, I'm going to pitch the nose up slightly to slow us down, come back slightly on the collective, as I want to return more or less to a hover position. Need to maintain enough power so I don't enter into a vortex, and as I pitch up I'm probably a little bit too much. As you can see, I'm certainly getting some feedback here. The vibration intensity does vary depending on your power setting, and although I don't show it here, if you were to bang into the ground, well, you certainly feel that. Very much the same as was the case with the Cessna 172. Okay, so we're more or less in a hover. Let's see now if we can land this thing without buckling the skids. As an aside, I have tried exactly this in VR, and the combination of virtual reality with the force feedback is absolutely amazing. and really is a game changer. But bottom line, force feedback device, well, you just want to fly more. It really does elevate the overall experience. We're coming in now, let's see if we can touch down without me embarrassing myself, trying to compensate for the ground effect, and we're down. And relatively smoothly. Well, certainly by my past experiences, didn't really get any feedback via the device, but as mentioned earlier, if you do a hard landing, you certainly are aware. Let's now get up in the air and give it a try. Let's raise the collective and gain some height, and say goodbye to the airport. Subsequently, I actually flew around for quite a while and chucked the helicopter around to allow me to judge the force feedback. The intensity of the vibration did vary from time to time, but as mentioned earlier, a lot of the features are not implemented. So at this time for a helicopter, a lot of the feedback was fairly generic, but it'll certainly be interesting to see how this develops over a period of time. Having force feedback at all certainly elevated the experience for me. I'd rather have some force feedback than none at all, but couldn't help at the end of the flight feeling a little bit disappointed that I couldn't experience more. Before I turn to my final thoughts and opinions, I do want to mention that Moza Racing supplied the base and the flight stick to the channel for the purposes of review, but have had no influence on the making of this video or my comments or opinions. In my personal opinion, this is a solid start from Moza Racing into the world of flight simulation and force feedback. There's no question in my mind that the components, the hardware itself, the base and the flight stick, meet, no, I'd go as far as to say exceeds expectation. Now, whilst it's a considered purchase, the base coming in at $600 or £549, we need to bear in mind that this places it fairly and squarely in the budget end of force feedback devices. However, no matter how good the hardware is, it's only as good as the software that supports it, and this is where more work needs to be done because, quite frankly, we're not there yet. Now, there's been quite a lot of development recently bringing in compatibility for Microsoft Flight Simulator, but the range of options, etc., needs to be expanded, and one can only hope that Moza continue in that vein. There are two things that I need to mention. The first one is careful consideration needs to be given to the mounting options for the base. It is a fairly large lump. I will, in the not too distant future, be doing a review not only of the flight stick, but of their desktop clamp. And like most of their other hardware, it's extremely well made, solid metal, etc. The other thing that I want to mention is perhaps a warning. Be careful if you try force feedback, because you're probably going to love it so much you'll never want to go back. Thank you very much for joining me today. I hope you found it useful and informative. Stay well, look after yourselves. See you again soon, and ciao for now.